The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty main street of Moab, Utah, and Katherine Foster stepped down with trembling hands clutching a letter that had arrived 3 days too late. The August heat of 1882 pressed against her like a physical weight, but it was nothing compared to the cold dread that had settled in her chest when the telegram reached her at the last way station. Thomas Vance, the man she had traveled 1,500 miles to marry, was dead. A riding accident, they said. Quick and merciful. But there was nothing merciful about standing alone in a strange town with $47 to your name and nowhere to go except back to a stepfather who had made it clear she was no longer welcome under his roof. Katherine adjusted her best traveling dress, a deep blue cotton that was now covered in the fine red dust of the Utah desert, and tried to compose herself. The main street of Moab stretched before her, a collection of weathered wooden buildings that seemed to sag under the relentless sun. A saloon, a general store, a hotel that looked like it had seen better days. Mountains rose in the distance, massive red rock formations that would have taken her breath away under different circumstances. Now they just made her feel smaller and more alone than ever. "Miss Foster." A man approached, removing his hat. He was older, perhaps 60, with a weathered face and kind eyes. "I'm Samuel Morrison, the town minister. I'm afraid I have some difficult news." "I already know," Katherine said, her voice steadier than she felt. "About Thomas." "The telegram reached me at the last station." Relief and sorrow mixed on the minister's face. "I'm so sorry. Thomas was a good man. The whole town is grieving. He was well loved here." He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "I hope you don't think poorly of us for not stopping you sooner. We sent the telegram as soon as we could, but you were already so far along the route." Katherine nodded, not trusting herself to speak. What could she say? That her entire future had collapsed in the space of a single telegram. That she had no money for a return ticket and no home to return to anyway. "There's a small fund," Morrison continued gently. "The town took up a collection. It's not much, but it should cover your lodging at the hotel for a few weeks and meals, give you time to make arrangements." The kindness of strangers was almost harder to bear than indifference would have been. Katherine felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had cried enough in the stagecoach. "Thank you. That's very generous." "Thomas's ranch is about 5 miles outside of town," Morrison said. "His brother arrived yesterday from Denver. He's been handling the arrangements. I believe he plans to sell the property and return to Colorado. Perhaps you'd like to meet him. Thomas spoke of you often in his letters. His brother might want to pay his respects." Katherine wasn't sure she could bear meeting the family of the man she would never marry, but she nodded anyway. What else could she do? "Yes, I suppose that would be appropriate." Morrison offered to escort her to the hotel first, and Katherine accepted gratefully. Her trunk and 2 carpetbags were unloaded from the stagecoach, and she followed the minister down the dusty street, acutely aware of the curious stares from townspeople. She supposed she made quite a sight, a lone woman in traveling clothes with luggage marked for a wedding journey that would never happen. The hotel was simple but clean, with a small lobby that smelled of pine soap and coffee. The proprietor, a thin woman named Mrs. Holloway, was kindness itself, showing Katherine to a second-floor room with a window overlooking the street. Once alone, Katherine finally allowed herself to sit on the narrow bed and let the full weight of her situation sink in. She had met Thomas Vance exactly once, 2 years ago when he had come back east to visit his sister in Boston. Katherine had been working as a seamstress at the time, taking in mending and alterations to help support her mother through a long illness. Thomas had needed a torn coat repaired, and they had struck up a conversation that had lasted far longer than the simple transaction required. He was thoughtful and earnest, with plans to build a cattle ranch in Utah Territory. He wanted a wife, a partner to share his dream. Katherine, exhausted from nursing a dying mother and facing an uncertain future, had been charmed by his vision of a new life in the West. They had courted through letters after he returned to Utah. Pages and pages of careful handwriting that revealed two lonely people reaching for connection across impossible distances. When her mother finally passed 6 months ago, Katherine had found herself alone except for a stepfather who made it clear he expected her to remarry quickly or find somewhere else to live. Thomas's proposal, when it came, felt like providence. A chance to start over, to build something meaningful. She had accepted without hesitation. Now she was here, and he was buried in the small cemetery on the hill above town. Katherine had never even kissed him, had never heard his laugh in person, only read about it in letters, and yet she grieved for the man and for the future they would never have. A knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. Katherine rose and opened it to find Morrison standing with another man, younger and tall, with dark hair, and the kind of sun-bronzed skin that came from working outdoors. He held his hat in his hands and looked almost as uncomfortable as Katherine felt. "Miss Foster," Morrison said. "This is Tanner Vance, Thomas's brother." Katherine's breath caught. The resemblance was striking. Tanner had the same strong jaw, the same direct gaze, though his eyes were a darker blue than Thomas's had been in the single photograph he had sent her. He was perhaps a year or two older than his brother had been, which would put him around 30. "Miss Foster," Tanner said, his voice low and rough. "I'm sorry we have to meet like this. Thomas was looking forward to your arrival. He talked about nothing else for months." "Thank you," Katherine managed. "I'm sorry for your loss. He seemed like a wonderful man from his letters." He was. Tanner shifted his weight, clearly struggling with something. "I wanted to talk to you if you have a moment. Morrison mentioned you might need some time to make arrangements. I want to help if I can." Morrison excused himself tactfully, leaving Katherine and Tanner alone in the doorway. Katherine gestured for him to come in, then left the door open for propriety's sake. Tanner stood near the window, looking out at the red mountains in the distance. "Thomas bought that land with everything he had," Tanner said quietly. "Spent 3 years building a house, starting a herd. He wanted it perfect before he sent for you. He wanted to give you a real home, not some rough cabin." He turned to face her, and Katherine was startled by the raw grief in his expression. "He was my younger brother. I should have been there. Should have stopped him from breaking that horse alone. But I was in Denver, and by the time I got the telegram, he was already gone." "You can't blame yourself," Katherine said softly. "Accidents happen. It's no one's fault, maybe." Tanner didn't look convinced. "But it doesn't change what's happened or what it means for you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Morrison says you came from Boston. That's a long way, and I'm guessing you wouldn't have made that journey unless you had good reason to leave." Katherine stiffened slightly. "My circumstances are my own concern." "I didn't mean to pry," Tanner said quickly. "I'm just trying to understand your situation. Morrison mentioned the town fund will help for a few weeks, but then what? Do you have family back east? Somewhere to go?" The question hung in the air between them. Katherine could lie, could maintain her pride and pretend she had options. But what was the point? "No," she said finally. "My mother died 6 months ago. I have a stepfather, but we're not close. There's nothing for me back in Boston." Tanner nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Then I have a proposition for you. Hear me out before you answer." Katherine waited, her heart beating faster. "Thomas made you a promise," Tanner said. "A home, a partnership, a future. He can't keep that promise now, but I can. Not exactly the way he planned, but close enough. He met her eyes directly. Marry me instead. Let me honor his promise. Katherine stared at him, certain she had misheard. What? I know how it sounds, Tanner continued. We're strangers. You came here to marry Thomas, not me. But think about it practically. That ranch is everything Thomas worked for. If I sell it and go back to Denver, it'll go to some stranger who will never appreciate what he built. But if you stay, if we marry, it becomes what Thomas wanted. A home, a working ranch, a legacy. You can't be serious. Katherine's mind was reeling. You don't even know me. Thomas knew you well enough to propose. He was a better judge of character than I am. If he thought you'd make a good wife, I'm willing to trust his judgment. Tanner's expression was earnest, almost pleading. I'm not promising romance or anything like that. This would be a practical arrangement, but you'd have a home, security, a future. And I'd have help running the ranch and honoring my brother's memory. This is insane. Katherine turned away, trying to process what he was suggesting. Marriage to a complete stranger, stepping into a dead man's shoes, living a life that had been meant for someone else. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was wrong, that she should refuse and figure out some other option. But what option? Return to Boston and beg her stepfather to take her in. Find work as a seamstress in some other city where she knew no one. She had $47 and no prospects. Tanner was offering her exactly what she had come to Utah seeking. The only difference was the groom. I know it's a lot to consider, Tanner said, his voice gentler now. I'm not asking for an answer right this minute. Take some time. Think about it. But know that the offer is genuine. I made Thomas a promise when we were boys that we'd always look out for each other. He's gone, but that promise still stands. And if honoring it means marrying the woman he loved, then that's what I'll do. Katherine turned back to face him, studying his features in the afternoon light. There was no deception in his face, no hint of ulterior motives, just grief and determination and a kind of desperate sincerity that made her chest ache. Why? She asked. Why would you do this? Saddle yourself with a stranger out of obligation to a dead man. Because he was my brother, Tanner said simply. Because I wasn't there when he needed me, and this is the only thing I can still do for him. And because you deserve better than being stranded in a strange town with nothing. He moved toward the door, then paused. I'll be at the ranch for the next few days, settling affairs. If you want to see it before you decide, Morrison can bring you out. Or if you decide this is too much and you want to go back east, I'll pay for your ticket. No strings attached. You have my word. Then he was gone, leaving Katherine alone with a decision that felt impossible. She sank back onto the bed, her mind spinning. Marry a stranger, live on a ranch in the Utah desert, step into a life that had been planned for someone else. It was madness. And yet, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor, Katherine found herself seriously considering it. She spent a restless night thinking about Thomas's letters, about the life he had described in careful detail. The house, with the wide porch facing the mountains. The creek that ran through the property year-round. The plan to raise cattle and maybe some horses. He had painted such a vivid picture that Katherine had dreamed about it on the journey west, imagined herself in that house, tending a garden, watching the sunset over red rock canyons. Could she still have that life with Tanner instead? Or would it be a constant reminder of what might have been? The next morning, Katherine woke with her decision made. She dressed carefully and went downstairs to ask Mrs. Holloway to send word to the minister. When Morrison arrived an hour later, she met him in the hotel lobby with her shoulders squared and her chin up. I want to see the ranch, she said. Can you take me there today? Morrison looked surprised but nodded. Of course. I'll arrange for a wagon. It's about an hour's drive. The journey out of town took them through the most striking landscape Katherine had ever seen. Red rock formations rose on either side of the rutted road, layers of stone in shades of crimson and orange and cream. The sky was impossibly blue, and despite everything, Katherine felt a flutter of excitement. Thomas had been right in his letters. This land had a wild beauty unlike anything back east. The ranch appeared as they crested a small rise, nestled in a valley between two mesas. The house was larger than Katherine had expected, a solid structure of wood and stone with the promised wide porch. There was a barn, a corral with several horses, and what looked like a chicken coop. Cottonwood trees provided shade near the house, and she could hear running water even from a distance. Tanner emerged from the barn as they pulled up, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked surprised to see them but not displeased. "Miss Foster, Morrison, welcome." Miss Foster wanted to see the property, Morrison said diplomatically. "I hope that's all right." "More than all right." Tanner helped Katherine down from the wagon. "Let me show you around." He led her first to the house, and Katherine's breath caught as they stepped inside. It was beautiful. Simple but well built, with large windows that let in streams of light. The main room had a stone fireplace and furniture that looked handmade but sturdy. There was a kitchen with a proper stove, 2 bedrooms, and even a small room that Thomas had apparently planned to use as an office. "He built most of it himself," Tanner said, pride evident in his voice. "Hired help for the heavy timber work, but the finish carpentry is all his. He wanted it right." Katherine ran her hand along a windowsill, feeling the smooth wood under her fingers. She could picture Thomas working here, measuring and cutting and fitting pieces together with care. It made him more real somehow, more than just words on paper. "The land runs about 300 acres, Tanner continued. "Not huge by ranching standards, but enough to support a decent herd. There's good grazing, and the creek never runs dry." Thomas chose well. They walked the property together, Morrison tactfully staying near the house while Tanner showed Katherine the barn and the pastures. He talked about Thomas's plans, the breeding stock he had selected, the expansion he had hoped for. Katherine listened and watched and tried to imagine herself here, not as Thomas's wife but as Tanner's. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally as they stood by the creek watching the water tumble over smooth stones. "Anything." "What do you do in Denver? What would you be giving up to stay here?" Tanner was quiet for a moment. "I work for a cattle company. Good job, decent pay, but it's someone else's operation. Someone else's dream. I've been saving to start my own place eventually, but it would be years before I could afford land like this." He picked up a stone and skipped it across a quiet pool. "This ranch represents everything I want. The only reason I'd sell is because staying here without Thomas feels wrong, like I'd be stealing his dream. But staying here with me wouldn't feel like stealing." "No," Tanner said firmly, "because that's what he wanted, you here on this land building a life. If I'm just the stand-in groom, so be it. At least his dream wouldn't die with him." Katherine studied his profile, the way he looked at the land with such longing and grief mixed together. "You loved him very much." "He was the best person I knew." Tanner's voice was rough. "Better than me by a long shot. Kinder, more patient, more hopeful about the world. He deserved to have everything he wanted. Instead, he got thrown from a horse and broke his neck at 28 years old." He turned to face her. "I can't give you the man you were supposed to marry. But I can give you the life he promised, if you'll have it." Katherine took a deep breath, feeling the Utah sun on her face and the sound of water in her ears. She thought about Boston, about the cramped room she had rented while doing piecework for pennies, about her stepfather's cold disapproval and the certainty that she had no future there. Then she thought about this house, this land, the possibility of something better. "All right," she said quietly, "I'll marry you." Tanner's eyes widened. "You're sure?" "No," Katherine admitted. "I'm not sure at all, but I don't have better options, and you seem sincere about wanting to honor your brother's promise. So yes, I'll marry you." Relief and something else, something harder to name, crossed Tanner's face. "Thank you. I promise I'll do right by you. This will be a real partnership. You'll have a say in how the ranch is run, and what's mine will be yours legally. I won't cheat you or mistreat you." "What about the marriage itself?" Katherine had to ask, had to know what she was agreeing to. "What are your expectations?" Tanner flushed slightly. "I expect we'll figure things out as we go. I'm not going to force anything on you. We can take our time getting to know each other. The house has 2 bedrooms. We'll use them unless you decide otherwise." It was the answer Katherine had hoped for, and yet it left her feeling strangely uncertain. This was to be a marriage of convenience then, nothing more. At least not at first. She supposed that was for the best. She couldn't imagine sharing a bed with this man she barely knew, no matter how noble his intentions. They returned to the house where Morrison was waiting. When Tanner explained that Katherine had accepted his proposal, the minister looked both relieved and concerned. "Are you certain about this, Miss Foster? It's a big decision to make so quickly." "I'm certain enough," Katherine said. "When can you perform the ceremony?" Morrison hesitated. "We should wait a decent interval, give you both time to be sure." "There's no point in waiting," Tanner said. "If we're going to do this, we should do it properly and soon. I need to send word to Denver that I won't be returning, and Miss Foster needs the security of marriage before the town fund runs out." "I could perform the ceremony in 3 days," Morrison offered. "That would give you time to post banns and make sure this is what you both want." 3 days. Katherine felt dizzy at how fast everything was moving. Just yesterday she had arrived expecting to marry Thomas. Now she was agreeing to marry his brother, a man she had met barely 24 hours ago. But Tanner was right. There was no point in drawing things out. Either she did this or she didn't. 3 days is fine, she said. The ceremony took place on a Sunday morning in the small church at the edge of Moab. Katherine wore the wedding dress she had packed so carefully in Boston, a simple cream silk that her mother had helped her sew before she got too sick to hold a needle. It felt wrong somehow, wearing a dress meant for another groom, but she had nothing else appropriate. She tried not to think about it as Morrison's wife helped her dress in the church's back room. "You're doing a brave thing," Mrs. Morrison said, adjusting Katherine's veil. "It takes courage to start a new life with someone you barely know." "Or foolishness," Katherine replied, attempting a smile. "Sometimes those are the same thing." The older woman squeezed her hand. "Tanner is a good man. He'll treat you well." Katherine hoped she was right. She barely knew Tanner beyond their few conversations, but she had observed him around town over the past 3 days. He was quiet and hardworking, helping repair a fence at the general store without being asked, tipping his hat respectfully to every woman he passed. People spoke well of him, said he had been devoted to his younger brother. That had to count for something. The church was nearly full when Katherine walked down the aisle, which surprised her. She barely knew anyone in Moab, and yet the townspeople had come out to witness this strange wedding. Perhaps they felt responsible, having taken up a collection for her. Or perhaps they simply wanted to see how this peculiar story would end. Tanner waited at the altar in a clean suit, his dark hair slicked back, and his expression solemn. He watched Katherine approach with something like wonder in his eyes, and she realized that this was probably almost as strange for him as it was for her. He had come to bury his brother and settle an estate. Instead, he was getting married to a woman he had met 3 days ago. The ceremony was brief, and traditional. Katherine spoke her vows in a steady voice, promising to love and honor a man whose first name she had barely gotten used to saying. Tanner's voice was deeper, rougher with emotion as he made his promises. When Morrison pronounced them man and wife, Tanner leaned in to kiss her, a brief, chaste press of lips that was over almost before it began. His lips were warm and he smelled of soap and something else. Something cedar like that wasn't unpleasant. Then it was done. Katherine Foster was now Katherine Vance, wife to a stranger, mistress of a ranch she had seen only once. The townspeople crowded around to offer congratulations and well wishes, and Katherine smiled until her face hurt, accepting their kindness while feeling like she was watching everything from a great distance. A small reception was held at the hotel, with cake and coffee provided by Mrs. Holloway. Katherine stood beside Tanner and made polite conversation, acutely aware of his presence beside her. He was her husband now. The reality of it was only beginning to sink in. Finally, as the afternoon light began to slant golden through the windows, Tanner leaned close and murmured, "Ready to go home." Home. The ranch that Thomas had built. Katherine nodded, suddenly exhausted. They said their goodbyes and climbed into the wagon Tanner had brought to town. Katherine's trunk and bags were already loaded in the back, everything she owned in the world now traveling to her new home. The drive was quiet, neither of them quite sure what to say. Katherine watched the red rocks pass by and tried not to think about the night ahead. Tanner had promised they would use separate bedrooms, but the intimacy of living together, of sharing a house and a life, was daunting regardless. "You all right?" Tanner asked eventually. "Just thinking," Katherine replied. "This morning I woke up unmarried in a hotel. Tonight I'll sleep in a ranch house as your wife. It's a lot of change." "We can take it slow," Tanner said. "There's no rush for anything. We'll just figure things out day by day." It was meant to be reassuring, and Katherine appreciated the sentiment. But it didn't ease the strangeness of the situation. When they arrived at the ranch, Tanner helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk inside. He showed her to the larger of the two bedrooms, the one that clearly had been meant to be the master bedroom. "Thomas built this for you," Tanner said. "It's yours. I'll take the smaller room." The bedroom was lovely, with a large bed covered in a quilt that looked handmade, a dresser, a wardrobe, and a window that faced the mountains. Katherine ran her hand over the quilt, wondering if Thomas had bought it or if someone local had made it for him. "Get settled in," Tanner said. "I'll make some supper. Nothing fancy, but I can manage beans and cornbread." Katherine unpacked slowly, hanging her few dresses in the wardrobe and placing her small collection of personal items on the dresser. A daguerreotype of her mother, the letters Thomas had written, a silver brush that had been her grandmother's. It didn't take long. She didn't own much. When she emerged, the house smelled of cooking food and Tanner was setting the table. They ate together in near silence, the awkwardness of new marriage heavy between them. Katherine tried to think of something to say, some way to break the tension, but everything felt forced. "Tell me about the ranch," she finally said. "What needs to be done? How can I help?" Tanner looked relieved to have a practical topic. "There's plenty to do. The cattle need checking daily. The chickens need tending. There's a garden Thomas started, but it needs work. Can you cook?" "Yes." "And sew and keep house. I'm not afraid of hard work." "Good, because ranch life is hard work, especially getting started." Tanner pushed beans around his plate. "Thomas had hired help lined up for the heavy work, but we'll need to manage most things ourselves, at least at first. Can you ride?" Katherine shook her head. "I've been on a horse once or twice, but I wouldn't call it riding. I'll teach you. You'll need to know how to get around the property." Tanner paused. "We'll make this work, Katherine. It might not be what either of us expected, but we'll make it work." Katherine wanted to believe him. She nodded and continued eating, trying to imagine herself as a rancher's wife, riding across this vast land, building a life with this quiet stranger across the table. That night, she lay in the large bed alone, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Somewhere outside, a coyote howled. The wind rustled through the cottonwood trees. In the next room, she could hear Tanner moving around, preparing for bed. Then the house fell silent except for the creaking of timbers and the endless whisper of wind. Katherine stared at the ceiling and wondered what Thomas would think of this arrangement. Would he approve of his brother stepping in to fulfill his promises? Or would he be horrified that she had agreed to marry a stranger? There was no way to know, and dwelling on it wouldn't change anything. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, tried to accept that this was her life now, for better or worse. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Tanner woke before dawn to tend the animals, and Katherine rose to make breakfast. They ate together, planned the day's work, then went their separate ways. Tanner taught her to ride using a gentle mare named Clover, and Katherine proved to be a quick learner despite her initial nervousness. She took over the garden and the chickens, pleased to discover that Thomas had planned well. The garden had good soil and a clever irrigation system fed by the creek. The chicken coop was solid and well designed, protecting the birds from predators. In the evenings, they ate dinner together and sometimes sat on the porch watching the sunset. Conversation came easier as they grew more comfortable with each other. Tanner told stories about growing up with Thomas, about their childhood in Missouri before their parents died, and they headed west, seeking opportunity. Katherine shared stories about Boston, about her mother's kindness and her own dreams of something more than endless mending in a cramped room. Slowly, gradually, they became something like friends. Katherine found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, to the sound of Tanner's rare laugh when she said something amusing. He was good company once he relaxed, thoughtful and surprisingly well-read. She learned that he loved this land with a passion that matched his grief for his brother, that he dreamed of building the ranch into something significant. But they maintained careful distance too. Tanner never entered her room without knocking. They didn't touch beyond the occasional accidental brush of hands. It was a chaste, practical marriage, exactly what they had agreed to. And yet, as summer deepened into fall, Katherine found herself noticing things. The way Tanner's shoulders moved when he worked. The rare smile that transformed his serious face. The gentleness in his hands when he handled the horses. She tried not to think about it, tried to focus on the work and the satisfying progress they were making. But late at night, alone in her bed, she couldn't help wondering what it would be like if this were a real marriage in every sense. If Tanner looked at her with something more than respectful distance. If his brief kiss at their wedding had been deeper, more meaningful. It was foolish to think such things, Katherine told herself firmly. This was a practical arrangement. Tanner had married her out of obligation, not desire. She needed to be content with the security and partnership he had offered. Then came the afternoon when everything shifted. Katherine was working in the garden, pulling weeds and checking the ripeness of the tomatoes, when she heard raised voices from near the barn. She straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, and saw 3 men on horseback talking to Tanner. Even from a distance, she could tell the conversation was not friendly. She hurried toward them, arriving in time to hear one of the men, a heavy-set rider with a thick beard, saying, "Your brother owed money, Vance. That debt doesn't disappear just because he died." "Thomas didn't owe anyone anything," Tanner said firmly. "He paid cash for this land and everything on it. I've seen the records." "Maybe he paid for the land," another rider said, this one lean and cold-eyed. but he borrowed money for those cattle in the north pasture. $500 at 20% interest. That debt is past due. Katherine's heart sank. $500 was a fortune. She moved to stand beside Tanner, and his jaw tightened as he noticed her. "This is my wife, Katherine," he said, "and these men are apparently debt collectors." "Show me proof," Katherine said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. If Thomas borrowed money, there would be paperwork, a contract signed and witnessed. The heavy-set man smiled unpleasantly. "Don't need a fancy contract out here, madam. A man's word is his bond." Thomas gave his word he'd pay back the money with interest by the end of August. It's now September. "Then Thomas would have paid if he were alive," Tanner said coldly. "But convenient for you that he's dead and can't confirm or deny your story." The lean man's hand moved toward his gun, and Katherine's blood ran cold. But the heavy-set man held up a hand, stopping his companion. "No need for violence. We're reasonable men. We'll give you 2 weeks to come up with the money plus interest. That's $575. If you can't pay, we'll take equivalent value in cattle and equipment." "Get off my land," Tanner said quietly, "and don't come back without proof of debt signed by my brother." The men exchanged looks. For a moment, Katherine thought they might draw their guns anyway. But finally, they turned their horses. 2 weeks, the heavy-set man called back. "We'll return with proof and payment." As they rode away, Katherine felt her legs go weak. Tanner put a hand under her elbow, steadying her. "Come on, let's go inside." In the kitchen, Tanner poured them both coffee with hands that shook slightly. "I'm sorry you had to see that. Who were those men?" "Local toughs. The heavy-set one is called Carson. He runs some cattle and does, let's say, various business dealings. I've heard the name but never met him before." Tanner sat heavily in a chair. "The worst part is, they might be telling the truth. Thomas mentioned in a letter a few months back that he was looking at purchasing some breeding stock. If he did borrow money, he might not have wanted to worry me with the details. Surely there would be records." Thomas seemed like the type to keep careful accounts. He was. Tanner's face was grim. "Which means if there's proof, it'll be in his papers. I've been meaning to go through his desk thoroughly, but I kept putting it off." He rubbed his face tiredly. "Let's look now." Thomas's office was a small room off the main living area. His desk was neat, with papers stacked in organized piles. Tanner and Katherine spent the next 2 hours going through everything. Farm records, receipts, letters, legal documents for the land purchase. But nowhere was there any mention of a loan from Carson or anyone else. Either Thomas didn't borrow the money or he didn't document it, Tanner concluded. "But I can't believe he'd be that careless. He documented everything else. So Carson is lying." "Probably. But that doesn't mean he won't come back and cause trouble. Men like that don't need the truth on their side. They just need to be willing to use violence." Tanner looked at Katherine, his expression troubled. "I won't let them take this ranch. Thomas worked too hard for it. But I also won't put you in danger. If this gets ugly, I want you to go back to town until it's settled." "Absolutely not," Katherine said firmly. "This is my home too. I'm not running. Katherine, these are dangerous men. Then we'll face them together." She met his eyes steadily. "You said this would be a partnership. That means I don't abandon you when things get difficult." Something shifted in Tanner's expression, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." Katherine was surprised to realize she meant it completely. Somewhere in the past months, this had stopped being just a practical arrangement. This ranch, this life, even this complicated marriage had become hers in a way that mattered deeply. She wasn't going to let anyone take it away. "All right then," Tanner said quietly. "We face it together." The 2 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Katherine and Tanner prepared as best they could. making sure they were never alone when working outside, keeping the rifle loaded and near the door. Tanner made a trip to town to speak with the sheriff, a tired-looking man named Porter who promised to investigate, but admitted that, without proof of wrongdoing, his hands were tied. "Carson's been operating around here for years," Porter told Tanner. "Nothing I can ever make stick, but plenty of rumors. He's smart enough not to break the law where I can see it. Best advice I can give you is don't give him an excuse to escalate." It was frustrating but not surprising. Justice in the Utah Territory was often rough and imperfect. Katherine tried not to think about what might happen when Carson returned. Instead, she focused on the work, on the rhythm of ranch life that had become comfortable and meaningful. One evening, about a week after the confrontation, Katherine was preparing dinner when Tanner came in looking thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he said, "about Thomas, about what he would want." Katherine turned from the stove. "What do you mean? He built this place with love. Every board, every fence post. He wanted it to be something good in the world, a place where people could build a decent life." Tanner leaned against the doorframe. "I've been so focused on just keeping it running that I haven't thought about making it thrive the way he dreamed. But we should. We should make this ranch something he'd be proud of." "We're already doing that," Katherine said gently. "We're living here, working the land, building a life. Isn't that what he wanted? It's part of it. But Thomas wanted more. He talked about eventually taking in people who needed a fresh start, maybe hiring drifters who couldn't find work elsewhere, building something that helped others, not just ourselves." Tanner smiled slightly. He was idealistic that way, thought everyone deserved a chance. Katherine felt her throat tighten. She hadn't known that about Thomas, and it made her grief for the man she never truly met sharper somehow. "That's a beautiful dream." "It is, and maybe someday we can make it real." Tanner pushed off the doorframe. "But first we have to make sure we still have a ranch to build that dream on." The day Carson returned arrived cool and cloudy, unseasonable weather for September in Utah. Katherine saw the dust of their approach from the kitchen window and called to Tanner, who was in the barn. He emerged quickly, rifle in hand, but pointed at the ground. Katherine joined him, her heart pounding but her hand steady. Carson rode up with 4 men this time, apparently expecting more resistance. He looked smugly confident as he reined in his horse. "Time's up, Vance. You have the money." "I have something better," Tanner said calmly. "The truth. I went back through every piece of paper Thomas had going back 3 years. There's no record of any loan from you or anyone else. He bought his cattle with cash saved over time, and I have the receipts to prove it." Carson's smile didn't waver. "Already told you we didn't need fancy paperwork. Your brother gave his word. Then you should have no trouble providing witnesses to this loan. Someone who saw money change hands, heard terms discussed, anything at all to support your claim." Tanner's voice was hard. "Because right now, all I have is your word, and frankly, your word isn't worth much in this territory." The lean man from before shifted in his saddle. "You calling Carson a liar?" "I'm saying if there was a legitimate debt, there would be proof. Since there's no proof, I'm not paying." Tanner raised the rifle slightly. "And if you try to take anything from this property, the sheriff will hear about it." "Sheriff Porter doesn't scare me," Carson said, but Katherine noticed he looked less confident than before. "And you're just one man with one rifle. Maybe you don't want to push this." "He's not alone," a new voice called. Katherine turned to see riders approaching from the direction of town. Morrison was there, along with the sheriff and 3 other men Katherine recognized as prominent townspeople. They formed a line beside Tanner and Katherine, a silent show of support. Sheriff Porter addressed Carson directly. "I've been asking around about this supposed loan. Funny thing, but nobody remembers you and Thomas Vance doing business together. Nobody saw money change hands. And Thomas was the kind of man who paid his debts promptly. So if he owed you money, he would have paid before it came to this. Carson's face darkened. You taking his side without proof? I'm saying that in the absence of documentation, I'm inclined to believe the word of a dead man who was known for his honesty over the word of a man who has been run out of 2 other territories for fraud. Porter's hand rested casually on his gun. I think you and your boys should ride on out of here. And if I hear about you bothering the Vances again, I'll find a reason to lock you up. We clear. The tension held for a long moment. Katherine barely breathed, watching Carson calculate his odds. 5 armed men against his 4 in defense of property and with the law on their side. Slowly, Carson's posture relaxed into something like defeat. Keep your land, he spat. It's not worth the trouble. He wheeled his horse around. But don't think this means you're welcome here, Vance. This town has a long memory. They rode away in a cloud of dust and anger. Katherine felt her knees go weak with relief. Tanner lowered the rifle and turned to Morrison and the sheriff with gratitude clear on his face. Thank you, he said simply. I won't forget this. Thomas was a good man, Morrison replied. And you've proven yourself cut from the same cloth. This town looks after its own. The men stayed for coffee and conversation, and Katherine bustled about making them comfortable, grateful beyond words for their support. When they finally left, the sun was setting in shades of orange and red across the endless sky. Katherine and Tanner stood on the porch watching the light fade, neither quite ready to go inside. I was terrified, Katherine admitted quietly. I thought they were going to start shooting. So was I. Tanner turned to look at her, and in the dying light his eyes were very blue. But you stood there like you weren't afraid at all. You were magnificent. Katherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. I was just trying not to shame myself. You could never shame yourself. Tanner reached out, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. Katherine, I know this marriage isn't what either of us expected, but I want you to know that I'm grateful every day that you agreed to it. You've made this ranch a home, made this life worth living. Katherine's heart beat faster. Tanner, you don't have to say anything. He looked away toward the darkening mountains. I just wanted you to know that you matter, that this matters. He gestured vaguely at the house, the land, the space between them. Katherine stepped closer, drawn by something she didn't quite understand. It matters to me too, more than I expected. Tanner looked back at her, and something passed between them, something electric and new. For a moment, Katherine thought he might kiss her. Actually kiss her, not the brief ceremonial touch at their wedding, but something real and meaningful. She found herself wanting it with a fierceness that surprised her, but Tanner stepped back, breaking the moment. It's been a long day. We should get some rest. Disappointment and relief mixed in Katherine's chest as they went inside. That night, lying alone in her bed, she admitted to herself what she had been denying for weeks. She was falling in love with her husband. The steady, quiet man who had married her out of obligation was becoming someone she cared for deeply. Someone she wanted in every sense of the word. The question was whether he felt the same way, and if he did, what they would do about it. The days following the confrontation with Carson settled back into routine, but something had shifted between Katherine and Tanner. There was an awareness now, a tension that hadn't been there before. Katherine caught Tanner watching her sometimes as she worked in the garden or prepared meals. And she found herself acutely conscious of him, of his presence in the house, his voice calling the horses, his rare laughter at something she said. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the cottonwood leaves turning gold. Katherine had been at the ranch for 2 months now, and it truly felt like home. She had made curtains for the windows, planted bulbs that would bloom in spring, learned the names and personalities of all the cattle. This was her life now, and she loved it with an intensity that sometimes surprised her. One afternoon, she was in town purchasing supplies when she ran into Mrs. Morrison at the general store. The older woman greeted her warmly and insisted on helping Katherine select fabric for a new dress. "You look happy," Mrs. Morrison observed. "Marriage agrees with you." Katherine felt herself blush. "The ranch is wonderful. I love the work. And Tanner," Mrs. Morrison's eyes were knowing. "How is married life with him?" Katherine busied herself examining a bolt of blue cotton. "He's a good man, very kind." "But," Mrs. Morrison prompted gently. "But nothing," Katherine said, then sighed. "It's just this was supposed to be a practical arrangement, a way to honor Thomas's promise and give me security. But lately it feels like something more, at least for me." "And you're afraid to say anything because you don't know how Tanner feels." "Exactly." Katherine abandoned the pretense of shopping and looked at the older woman directly. "What if I'm wrong? What if he only sees me as an obligation? It would make everything so awkward." Mrs. Morrison smiled. "My dear, I've seen the way that man looks at you. It's not the look of obligation. It's the look of a man who's falling in love and doesn't quite know what to do about it." Katherine's heart leaped. "You really think so?" "I do. But you might need to make the first move." Men can be terribly stubborn about these things, especially when they think they're being noble. Mrs. Morrison patted Katherine's hand. "Life is short. Thomas's death taught us all that. Don't waste time being afraid to reach for happiness." Katherine thought about those words all the way back to the ranch. Was Mrs. Morrison right? Did Tanner feel the same pull she did? And if so, what should she do about it? That evening after dinner, they sat on the porch as had become their custom. The air was cool, and Katherine had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Tanner nursed a cup of coffee and looked out at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Can I ask you something?" Katherine said, her courage gathered. "Of course." "You ever regret it? Marrying me, I mean. Staying here instead of going back to Denver?" Tanner turned to look at her, surprise clear on his face. "No, never. Why would you think that?" "I just wondered. You gave up a lot to honor Thomas's promise, your job, your life in the city. Sometimes I worry that you resent it." "Katherine, staying here and marrying you is the best decision I've ever made." Tanner set down his coffee cup. "I thought I was doing it for Thomas, but that's not true anymore. I'm here because I want to be. Because this ranch feels like home in a way Denver never did. And because you." He trailed off, looking uncertain. "Because I what?" Katherine's heart was racing. Tanner stood and walked to the porch railing, his back to her. "Because you've become important to me, more important than I expected. I know we agreed this would be a practical arrangement, and I've tried to respect that. But lately, I've been thinking that maybe we could make it something more, if you wanted, if I haven't completely misread things between us." Joy and relief flooded through Katherine. She stood and crossed to him, putting a hand on his arm until he turned to face her. "You haven't misread anything. I've been feeling the same way, I just didn't know how to say it." "Really?" Hope lit Tanner's face. "You're not just being kind. I'm not being kind, I'm being honest." Katherine took a breath. "I came here to marry Thomas, and I think I would have been happy with him. But these months with you, building this life together, I've come to care for you deeply. Not as Thomas's brother or as a stand-in husband, as yourself, as Tanner." "Katherine." Her name was a rough whisper. Then Tanner was cupping her face in his work-roughened hands, looking at her with such tenderness that it made her chest ache. "Can I kiss you? Really kiss you? Please," she breathed. This kiss was nothing like the brief touch at their wedding. This was heat and want and months of growing feelings finally finding expression. Tanner's lips moved against hers with a hunger that Katherine matched, her hands fisting in his shirt to pull him closer. When they finally broke apart, Both breathing hard, Tanner rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "So have I," Katherine laughed, giddy with happiness. "We've been very foolish, haven't we? Dancing around each other when we both felt the same way. Extremely foolish." Tanner kissed her again, softer this time, "But we can make up for lost time." They went inside together, and for the first time, Tanner followed Katherine to her bedroom door. She turned to face him, suddenly nervous despite everything they had just said. "Stay with me tonight, are you sure?" Tanner's eyes searched her face. "I don't want to rush you. I'm sure." Katherine took his hand. "I want this to be a real marriage, in every way." Tanner's answer was to kiss her again, deeper this time, and Katherine pulled him into the room, closing the door on their separate lives. What followed was tender and careful, two people learning each other with patience and growing passion. There was awkwardness and uncertainty, but there was also genuine connection, the physical expression of feelings that had been building for months. Afterward, lying in Tanner's arms with her head on his chest, Katherine felt a peace she hadn't known since her mother died. This was right. This was home. "I love you," Tanner said quietly into the darkness. "I don't know when it happened exactly, but it's true. I love you, Katherine." Tears pricked Katherine's eyes. "I love you too." They fell asleep tangled together, and when Katherine woke in the morning to find Tanner still beside her, his arm around her waist, she smiled. This was her life now. Her husband, her home, her future, and it was everything she could have wanted. The winter that followed was cold but joyful. Katherine and Tanner grew closer every day, their marriage transforming into something deep and passionate. They worked the ranch together, made plans for spring, and spent long evenings by the fire talking and laughing and simply being together. Katherine had never been happier. In December, she realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a mix of joy and terror. She told Tanner that evening over dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, he simply stared at her. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "A baby, really, really?" Katherine twisted her napkin nervously. "I know we didn't plan for this so soon, but nothing. This is wonderful." Tanner came around the table and pulled her into his arms. "We're going to have a baby, a family." Katherine relaxed against him, relief making her weak. "You're happy?" "I'm over the moon." Tanner kissed the top of her head. Thomas would have loved this, knowing his ranch would be home to the next generation. The mention of Thomas didn't sting the way it once might have. Katherine had made her peace with the ghost of the man she never married. She honored his memory by loving his brother and caring for the land he had built, but her life was with Tanner now. Her future was with him. The baby, a boy, was born in late June of 1883, delivered by the town doctor with Mrs. Morrison assisting. Katherine labored through a hot afternoon and into the evening, with Tanner pacing anxiously in the next room. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and healthy, Tanner was called in to meet his son. "He's perfect," Tanner breathed, touching one tiny fist with a gentle finger. "He's absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas James Vance, honoring both Thomas and Tanner's father. Little Tom, as they called him, was a good baby, healthy and cheerful. Katherine fell completely in love with motherhood, amazed by the fierce protectiveness she felt for this tiny human they had created. Life on the ranch continued its rhythm, now punctuated by a baby's cries and laughter. Tanner proved to be a devoted father, taking Tom with him on short rides around the property, teaching him to love the land even before he could walk. Katherine watched her husband with their son and felt her heart expand with love. The ranch prospered as well. They expanded the herd, built a new barn, hired seasonal help during busy times. The dream Thomas had planted and Tanner had cultivated was growing into reality. They became known in Moab as a solid, reliable operation, and their home was always open to travelers who needed a meal or a place to rest. One evening, when Tom was about 2 years old and running around getting into everything, Katherine and Tanner sat on the porch watching the sunset. Tom was chasing chickens in the yard, his laughter ringing out across the property. "You ever think about him?" Katherine asked quietly. "Thomas, I mean. Wonder what he'd think of all this, all the time," Tanner admitted. "I think he'd be happy, proud of what we've built, and I think he'd love seeing his namesake tearing around the place. I wish I'd known him, really known him, not just through letters." "He would have loved you." Tanner took her hand. "But I'm selfish enough to be glad things worked out the way they did, because this life with you is more than I ever dared to hope for." Katherine squeezed his hand. "I feel the same way. I came here thinking I knew what my future would be. But this, what we have, is so much better than anything I imagined." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their son play, and the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The ranch stretched around them, solid and prosperous, a testament to hard work and love. This was home. This was family. This was everything. Years passed in a blur of seasons. Tom grew into a sturdy, curious boy who loved the ranch as much as his parents did. When he was 4, Katherine gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Daniel and Rose. The house rang with children's laughter, and Tanner built an addition to give them more space. The ranch continued to grow. They bought adjacent land when it became available, expanded their operations, earned a reputation for quality cattle. Tanner was known throughout the territory as a fair and honest rancher, and Katherine became respected for her business sense and her hospitality. Their home was a gathering place for neighbors and travelers alike. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Tanner surprised Katherine with a trip to Denver. It was the first time they had left the ranch overnight since they married, and Mrs. Morrison happily agreed to watch the children. They stayed in a fine hotel, attended the theater, and walked the city streets hand in hand like courting sweethearts. "You ever miss this?" Katherine asked, looking at the bustling city around them. "The excitement, the culture?" "Not for a second." Tanner pulled her closer. "Everything I need is on that ranch with you. This is just a nice visit." Katherine smiled. "Good. Because I was thinking we might need that extra bedroom we talked about building, the one with the window facing east." Tanner stopped walking. "Katherine, are you saying?" "I'm saying that come spring, Daniel and Rose are going to have a little brother or sister." Tanner whooped and picked her up, spinning her around right there on the Denver street while passers-by smiled at the obvious love between them. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, not caring who saw. "4 children," he said wonderingly. "We're going to have 4 children." "Is that all right?" Katherine teased, though she knew the answer. "It's more than all right, it's perfect." Tanner kissed her again. "You're perfect. This life is perfect." The baby, another girl they named Charlotte, was born healthy and strong in April of 1893. The ranch was now a thriving operation, and the Vance family was well established in the community. Tom, at 10 years old, was already helping with serious ranch work. The twins, at 6, were a whirlwind of energy and mischief, and baby Charlotte was adored by everyone. Katherine sometimes looked at her life and could hardly believe it was real. She thought of the frightened woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Moab 11 years ago, facing an uncertain future with nothing but $47 and a letter telling her the groom was dead. That woman would never have believed this could be her life. A thriving ranch, a husband she loved deeply, 4 beautiful children, a place in the community. It was more than she had ever dared to dream. One evening, after the children were in bed, Katherine and Tanner walked down to the creek together. It was a warm summer night, and the stars were brilliant overhead. They stood by the water, listening to its familiar burble, surrounded by the land they had built together. "Do you remember the first time you brought me here?" Katherine asked. "When you were showing me the ranch before we married. I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I'd ever met." Tanner wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Coming all this way to marry a stranger, then agreeing to marry a different stranger to save your future. Most people would have run. I had nowhere to run to." Katherine leaned back against him. "But I'm so grateful I stayed. This life, this family, it's everything I never knew I wanted." "I'm grateful you stayed too. Grateful every single day." Tanner turned her in his arms to face him. "I love you, Katherine Vance. More now than the day I married you, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." Katherine stretched up to kiss him, tasting the promise and permanence of a love that had grown from the most unlikely beginnings. "I love you too. Always." They walked back to the house together, hand in hand, ready for whatever the future might bring. The ranch Thomas had built had become a home filled with love and laughter. The promise he had made to a woman he barely knew had been honored in ways none of them could have imagined. And the cowboy who had stepped in to fulfill that promise had found his own happiness in the process. As Katherine climbed into bed that night, Tanner already asleep beside her, she sent a silent thank you to the man she had never met. "Thank you, Thomas, for building this place, for dreaming this dream, for loving your brother enough to make him promise to look after me. Because of you, I found a home. Because of you, I found love." The years continued their steady march. The children grew, each developing their own personality and dreams. Tom became a skilled rancher, talking seriously about taking over the operation one day. Daniel showed a talent for working with horses that amazed even Tanner. Rose inherited Katherine's business sense and love of numbers, keeping meticulous records of ranch operations even as a young girl. And Charlotte, the baby, was a wild spirit who loved the land with a fierce passion that reminded everyone of Thomas. Katherine and Tanner grew older together, their love deepening with every year. There were hard times, drought years and harsh winters, illness and injury and all the challenges that came with ranching. But they faced everything together, their partnership tested and proven time and again. On a crisp fall morning in 1900, Katherine stood on the porch of the ranch house, now expanded and improved far beyond Thomas's original vision. Tanner came up behind her, his hair now streaked with silver, and wrapped his arms around her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their 18 years of marriage. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Katherine gestured at the land spreading before them, the cattle grazing peacefully, the barn where Tom was teaching Daniel how to repair tack, the garden where Rose and Charlotte were harvesting late vegetables. "I'm thinking about how different my life could have been. If Thomas hadn't died, I would have married him and probably been happy, but I wouldn't have had this life with you, these children, this exact perfect reality." "You think Thomas knew somehow?" Tanner asked quietly. "That sending me to meet you would lead to all this?" "No. But I think he would approve." Katherine turned in his arms. "You honored his promise, Tanner. You gave me everything he wanted me to have and so much more. You gave me love. Real, deep, lasting love. That's the greatest gift anyone could receive. You gave me the same thing." Tanner kissed her softly. "I came to Moab to bury my brother and I found my future instead. Found you. I'm the luckiest man alive." Katherine smiled. "We're both lucky. Incredibly, impossibly lucky." They stood together on the porch, watching their children and their land, feeling the weight of years and the lightness of love balanced perfectly. The sun rose higher, burning off the morning mist, revealing the red rock mountains in all their glory. It was going to be a beautiful day. Inside, breakfast needed to be made. Cattle needed tending. The endless work of ranch life awaited. But for this moment, Katherine and Tanner simply stood together, grateful for everything they had built, everything they had become. Two strangers brought together by tragedy had created something beautiful. A marriage, a family, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. "Come on," Katherine said finally, tugging Tanner toward the door. "Those children will be starving and we have a full day ahead." "Always working," Tanner teased, but he followed her willingly as he had for 18 years and would for all the years to come. The house swallowed them up, warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds of family and life and love. Outside, the Utah sun climbed higher, illuminating the ranch that three people had built together, each contributing something essential. Thomas had provided the vision and the foundation. Tanner had supplied the determination and the love. And Katherine had brought the heart that made it all into a home. The story that had begun with death and desperation had transformed into one of hope and happiness. A bride had arrived to find her groom dead, and a cowboy had said he would honor his brother's promise. Neither of them could have known that promise would lead to a love story that would span decades, produce 4 beautiful children, and create a legacy that would endure for generations. But that's exactly what happened. And in the end, everyone got exactly what they needed, even if it wasn't what they had originally expected. Katherine got her home and her family. Tanner got his ranch and his love. And Thomas, wherever he was, could rest knowing that his dream had come true in ways more beautiful than he could have imagined. The Vance ranch prospered for another 40 years under Tanner and Katherine's care, then passed to their children and grandchildren. The house Thomas built still stood, though expanded and modernized over the decades. And every generation told the story of how it all began, of the bride who arrived to marry a dead man and the cowboy who stepped in to honor his brother's promise, finding his own happiness in the process. It was a good story, a true story, a love story worth remembering, and Katherine and Tanner lived it together, deeply in love until the very end of their days.